morning, everybody. I can still say that for a few minutes. So thank you, Christine, and thank you to all the folks at Zpryme for having us. As Christine mentioned, my name's Lloyd Adams, and I run the utilities practice for SAP America. And this is our first year of being one of the premier sponsors of this great conference here at ETS. So I want to thank Christine, the whole Zpryme team. It's a real privilege to be here. My team and I are really enjoying ourselves. And I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing our next featured speaker, who is Michael McGhee from the U.S. Army. So just a little bit about you before I turn it over to you, sir. So for the last, beginning of last year, Michael's been serving as the Executive Director of the Office of Energy Initiatives for the U.S. Army. And then prior to that, he served 10 years as Principal Director of Infrastructure Policy for the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the United States Air Force. Right? So obviously, very knowledgeable around armed services. He holds an MA and an MBA from Webster University and a Master of Science in National Resource Strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. So that is a mouthful. I do not feel worthy sitting next to you up here. Look, our conversation today is going to center around what the Army's doing around the topics of safety, reliability, and the cost of power, right? And then take it even further, right? He's going to highlight some exciting opportunities for folks out in the utilities and the energy sector, and some ways that the Army is currently partnering to generate more assets with companies such as yours, and opportunities in the future for those of you that might not be, where you can take some of that from here. So without further ado, Michael, welcome to Zpryme.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Mic check, everybody. First row here. We good? Can you hear me? Thank you. So can I get a quick straw poll? How many of you have served in the military, just to get a sense of my audience here? Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your service. I'm a veteran as well. I haven't seen combat. That's great. Thank you. So it's worth asking because some people simply have no idea of what their military is about and what it performs for you other than what you might see on television. We're a vast enterprise. The U.S. Army has over 150 installations around the world, but also primarily here in the United States. We have the active forces that you're mostly familiar with, and the Guard that you're familiar with, maybe in the reserve forces as well. The Guard forces principally work for the governor of the states and the adjutant general that reports to the governor of states. And then when they're federalized for national service, they come into the active force enterprise to serve as well there. So it's quite the enterprise. You will not hear the word enterprise, by the way, uttered very often inside the Army unless you're talking about Star Trek. We think very locally and not broadly. We think about the commander that serves and commands units of people that are organized for a task, and it's a decentralized management model. So when you try to look across this enterprise and do something as one cohesive organism, it's often a challenge because commanders know best, and we allow them the discretion to make choices. So one of the things that commanders need is energy, and increasingly, like you hear from a number of parties, the interconnected world means there's an increasing familiarization and awareness that energy is vital to the ability to deliver that mission, as we call it, and to get your forces to be able to deliver and perform that mission when and where needed and when called upon to do that. We have forces that spend a lot of their time preparing to engage in combat typically, and we call that general idea readiness. Are you ready to serve? Are you trained? Are you organized? Are you equipped? Are you mentally tough? Are you prepared to go? And it used to be the idea was when they would go forward, they're gone. They maybe go across the ocean. They go overseas because we try to keep harm at arm's length. We try to keep it away before it comes here, perhaps. But in this increasingly interconnected society, those forces that go forward are supported back here more and more. And so our installations back here are serving 24/7, 365 to support those missions that are performed around the world. We have Army people deployed in 140 countries as of a statistics I saw last year. So that mission is vital, and that mission relies vitally upon energy. So I wanted to stretch the boundary a bit to talk about something the Army's focused on for my office. I happen to be thrilled to be the director of an office that is focused on initiatives to improve the security and resiliency of the power that's delivered to our bases. That's why the title up here is Beyond Safe, Reliable, and Affordable, which is a mantra that you hear from almost any utility provider. It's typically burned into a vision statement or mission statement. We submit that in addition to safe, reliable, and affordable, which is all priced in, arguably, there's a lot of transition underway that we've talked about here during these sessions, but there's two other pieces I'd like to speak to. That's security and resiliency. And as you perhaps might expect, the Department of Defense has a formal definition for those two terms, but I'll tell you what they mean to me. Security means, are you able to protect those various assets that you're expecting to perform when you need them? Is a 6-foot-high chain link fence and a keep-out sign sufficient to provide security? Now, I know that's an understatement for some of the security measures that are out there, but I hope you appreciate the point. We don't think it's necessarily secure enough. Then beyond that, if your plan A fails, that is, you fail to keep those assets secure, what is your plan B? And I think of that as resiliency. What do you have up your sleeve to help ensure that you can recover from any incident? It may not be just merely a weather-related outage, although there is, and we expect there to be, an increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events to occur increasingly over time. That's what's proving out, and that's what we expect to continue to increase, and we want to be prepared for that. We want you to be prepared for that. But also there's what I would call determined attacker scenarios. There's people out there that are attempting to do harm, as was discussed many times. Cyber is now recognized as a warfighting domain. There's air, there's space, there's ground, there's sea, and there's cyber. There are people in the cyber domain who are actively attacking assets here in the United States and around the world. And we have people that are trained and prepared to counterattack against that. It is a warfighting domain now. So we know cyber is another example of what I'll call a determined attacker, but there's also physical attacks. There's people with instruments of destruction, shotgun, rifle, who are attempting to harm the power grid. Is it secure? Is it resilient? So what the Army would like to do is help facilitate improving the security and the resiliency of our bulk power system. And we would like to help do that in a way that it gets priced in. We don't want to pay for some special armored capability that only serves the military or individuals. We want our bulk power system to be more secure and more resilient, and we'd like to facilitate that. My office does that for a living. Can we pull up the map slide, please? I'm going to show you something that could be distracting, but I want you to just sort of soak it in for a minute. So what you should be seeing is the United States behind me and a whole bunch of boxes. The dark green boxes are projects that we have that are already operating, and the light green boxes are projects that we have that are under construction. The sort of orangey yellow are projects that we have that are under contracts or negotiation, and the blue is stuff that's under early development. There's even stuff that's at the concept stage that's not shown here. But what these projects are private investment in creating new generating assets, and in some cases storage assets, that also can be configured to provide power to the Army in the event of a grid disruption. So these are generating assets that are in the rate base. They're provided at avoided cost by the utility, or they're provided at an economical cost by a private investor. The projects that are constructed or in the process of being constructed represent about $639 million in private investment. In some cases where we're actually taking the power from these projects, they represent a sizable over $100 million in cost avoidance to the Army, but most of these we aren't taking the power. We're buying the power from our normal contract that we purchase power from. So we're facilitating the bulk power system, utilities, and independent power producers to create new generating assets that are distributed, that increase the diversity of the supply chain and follow the distributed generation model, but also in exchange for siting them on Army bases behind our secure perimeter, they also are able to be, in some cases, turned inward to provide power to the base. Where you see a red outline around these boxes, that's what I call an islandable capability. That is where we have a project that can be turned inward in the event of a grid disruption, or if we anticipate a grid disruption. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those. I can start that right now. Over here, let's see, down here, which I'm blocking, is Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. So on the island of Oahu, if you've been there, there's a Hawaii Army installation called Schofield Barracks. There's several actually on Oahu. The power delivery system on Oahu is largely driven with fuel oil and increasingly renewables, but fuel oil that comes into thermal plants at the coast. Those plants at the coast are vulnerable to tsunami. They're also completely dependent on imported fuel. So this project being built on Schofield Barracks right now as we speak, when it's completed in 2018, will be above the tsunami strike zone, up in the hills above the coastline. It will be fed with 50% fuel oil, but also 50% biofuel that's being indigenously developed on the island. It will have a supply of oil available for 5 days, and then another 30 days available on the island. So we have on-site generation coupled with on-site fuel supply, coupled with controls that can flip this plant inward in the event of a grid disruption. So that, to me, presents a fantastic opportunity to increase the security and resiliency of the grid. This is for Oahu, which again is a closed sort of environment. But we have projects similar to that at Fort Drum in New York, one under development in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, one in Los Alamitos, which is the Los Angeles area in California. Again, the red box means an islandable capability. The ones without the red box, we went where the money went at the time. The money was flowing into renewables, and it still is. But with renewables, we're going to need that affordable, economical storage to go along with that, to have on-site generation coupled with some on-site storage, coupled with the control systems. So the Army is doing its part to help facilitate the the construction of new generating assets, the construction and siting of energy storage systems in exchange for some sort of improved security and resiliency that has a benefit to the Army.
So we've been getting to know each other the last couple of days, and when I first saw this, I was simply blown away by kind of the expanse of this. But you mentioned, in your opening, grid vulnerability. From your perspective, Michael, how do you believe, how solid is the grid, and how could we sustain, prolonged outage? And by prolonged, I mean anything, week plus. What's the Army's perspective on that?
Right. So the Army, back in the day, the Army was quite literally the frontier. We're talking, 100 and in some cases 200 years ago. At that time, we provided our own water, and then such as was sewage at the time, and then later some sewage treatment plants, for example, water treatment plants, and then power in some cases. Those days are largely gone. We've recognized that's not the Army's core competency to do that. We would like to. We are trying to privatize most of our utility systems that remain. That is water distribution systems, sewage distribution systems. We don't really have much in the way of generating assets, but we are relying upon the grid that you're relying upon, most of you. We also have some on-site generation, but it is minor compared to our overall demand. We consume about $1 billion a year of energy, primarily in the form of electricity, but also natural gas and steam and a few other items. So we're relying upon that grid. If you're involved in the power distribution business, you're aware of what we're aware of, which is there is a vulnerability there. And it's one of those things where now you start going, okay, let's talk about the risk or the probability of something occurring versus the consequence of that occurring. The risk may be this big, but the consequence could be huge. And with the vulnerabilities that we're aware of, that many of you are aware of, we would not be talking the 3-day weather outage, or maybe even the extended 4 or 5-day weather outage. I was reminded the other day for Hurricane Katrina, a story where it appears that on day 4 they began to euthanize some people that were in care facilities there that they had lost all hope. They thought there's nobody coming to the rescue. That was on day 4, right? So if we experience a determined attacker scenario that is able to do great harm or a cyber attack to the grid, I think you know what we know. That could be not just merely days, but it could be weeks. Potentially even in extreme circumstances, perhaps months. You don't want to be Chicken Little here, but you have to face that. And you have to say, what is your plan B? What is your plan A, and what is your plan B? You do not have to bulletproof this entire affair. I understand that. It would be of great cost to do that, but we have to be contemplating those scenarios. So the Army is contemplating those scenarios. We want to ensure that we have a plan B. These islandable facilities that I mentioned here, 30 days of islandable capability. Fort Drum, 30 days of islandable capability. The Army has recently tasked itself through a directive that all mission commanders must examine their energy and water needs and prepare to have at least a 14-day capability to assure power and assure water to those mission-critical infrastructure items. That is, you can't just count upon maybe a 3-day outage. You have to plan for a 14-day event. So that may not look like backup diesel gensets. It may look more like these kinds of projects. So we think our interests align well with what the transformation interests are that we've discussed here the past few days, where distributed generation can fit nicely with what we're trying to do and also bring security and resiliency to people that rely upon the grid like we do.
So talk about that. So distributed generation, I think for perhaps some in this room not too long ago, many organizations in our sector were perhaps viewing that as a threat. And I think that cat's now, for most, if not all, way out of the bag. But what's your perspective in terms of where we're going next with that?
I would fully agree, and I think listening to the audience and the discourse the past couple days, I believe that we would all be in general agreement the cat is out of the bag there. You're not going to preserve this large centralized model as your most efficient way forward. There's technology evolvement that has made the smaller generating plants that are fast-starting natural gas plants, for example, they've become as efficient as the plants that drove the need for these large centralized plants in the past. I think the cat is out of the bag in terms of the distributed generation model. I think that just a year ago, you may be asked that question and you might have gotten a different answer, but it's evolving very quickly, and I think it is recognized by the utilities that we talk to that their customers are calling for it, and they see the sense in it economically. And where a partner like the Army, or perhaps even the Air Force or the Navy, we have, by the way, an agreement with the U.S. Air Force. They sit in my office with me and my staff, and they're creating a similar office like our office to generate projects like these on Air Force installations. The Navy also has a similar office as well, and I would submit to you their interests are very close to what I'm describing today. We can help facilitate these projects. I think the cat is out of the bag for distributed generation, whether that be actual generating plants or lately distributed energy resources in the form of large utility-scale batteries.
So you mentioned the utilities that you talk to, and I know that's part of the story that you want to tell. So just for the benefit of everybody here in the audience, expand on that. Like, what is your engagement model with utilities? What is it today? Where do you see that going next?
So we were, when I arrived with the Army roughly a year and a few months ago, I found that our appetite was larger than what was on our plate. And so we explored how can we increase the engagement? How can we find where are the avenues that can generate projects like this and enthusiasm? Because a lot of it is just communication. It's coming to events like this. It's sharing what we're doing, maybe opening some eyes to what the possibilities are. What we found was if we tried to sort of find these opportunities ourselves, our kill ratio was pretty low. We would not be able to successfully put together the components to make a project economically viable that is affordable to be paid for with other people's money, private investment. It has to be economical. Where one of our installations, one of our Army installations, also did some smart thinking and came up with a project, the kill ratio was also kind of low on that. Where a independent power producer came to us with a potential deal arrangement, we found their risk tolerance was a bit higher. And so there was some risk that these projects were not going to make it. They thought they had some sort of an inside track, perhaps, and that didn't pan out. What we did find, however, was utilities were rock solid. They were steady Eddie. They had done their homework. I submit probably because their risk tolerance is much lower. Sure. Their dictated rate of return requires them to be solid in their assessments. When they would bring a project or proposal to us for evaluation, we would find they are very likely to be successful. And so we have engaged substantially with the utility industry, but also with independent power producers who are looking to make a private investment as well.
So at the risk of perhaps overscheduling you from the moment you walk off the stage here, for those representing organizations that maybe haven't gotten to that point, with you all, how do we get started?
Yeah, so it's pretty easy. It may not feel easy, perhaps, but when you touch the face of the government, you are sucked in sometimes. So my office, for example, behind me on the first slide, there was our URL, www.oei.army.mil. And I can't tell you how much money that's worth to have a short URL in the Army, because they're usually about this long. So oei.army.mil is a great, easy way to engage. I'm located, my office is just outside the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, an area known as Crystal City, if you're familiar with that area. We look out across at the Reagan National Airport. It's right outside our window. We're available. We have space to meet. We engage regularly with, not so much with vendors, because we're not buying anything, frankly. We're not buying a technology. We're interested in those that are setting up projects and are looking to site them and might be interested in siting them on Army property. So it's worth knowing that the Department of Defense has certain authorities that many federal agencies just don't have. We hold land. It may not seem dramatic to you to state that, but many federal agencies they don't. The General Services Administration is their landlord. Right. They hold the land for these other agencies. The Department of Defense, we hold our own land, and therefore we have authorities to lease that land or provide easements for utilities on that land. So we have these real estate authorities that we can employ to perhaps help facilitate a project being established on Army land. We also have power purchase authority. That is, we can buy power direct. Many federal agencies don't do that. They, again, go through the General Services Administration to buy power for them on their behalf. So we have authorities to buy power. We have authorities to outgrant or lease or provide easements on land, and we employ those authorities. We also have a contracting type of authority that's different that we're exploring called energy savings performance contracts, where we capitalize upon an efficiency opportunity, and we use that to bring private investment in to pay for upgrades, to cause efficiencies, and then we share in the return on that. But primarily what we've done is we've used our real estate authorities and our power purchase authorities in some cases to facilitate these projects. So if you want to engage with us, you can reach out to me. I should be in the roster for this. You can come to www.oei.army.mil, and you can find how to connect with us. And we'd love to meet. We can set up a video teleconference. We can host you in our offices in Arlington, Virginia, if you're in town. And we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you for that. So let's shift gears for a second. So I'm sure many in the room would be curious to hear your prognosis for both on-site and the diversity of fuels over the next 5 to 10 year horizon. Perspectives?
Yeah, so the military is the largest consumer of energy in the federal government. And that is primarily from jet fuel. We buy tremendous amounts of jet fuel for the Air Force. The largest consumer of electricity in the federal government is the Army because of our facilities and what we do. So we've long ago decided that it's folly to pick winners and losers, to try to back any particular technology in terms of saying we want this or we want that in terms of energy supply. For example, for jet fuel, we said that really the important thing is as long as it can fit in the distribution system, the supply chain, the pipelines, the trucks, the tanks, the maintenance crews, if it's compatible with that, that's all we care about. So we're agnostic on the actual source of where that fuel may come from. And there's technologies to develop new forms of jet fuel, from plant oil, from animal fats, for example, or from alcohols. Same with power for electricity purposes. We're mostly agnostic. There is a federal statute that requires us to increase the amount of renewable power that we use as our mix. It's to be 25% of our mix by 2025. We're at about 9.5% as of the close of last year, so we've got a ways to go there. So we're not completely agnostic. We are looking to increase our use of renewables. But in my office, we go where the money goes. If there's money to be invested in renewables, we'll talk about that. If there's money for natural gas projects, we'll talk about that too. Coal doesn't come to us ever, so I don't foresee that happening, but we're otherwise agnostic about fuel source because we know that you're looking at it more as an economical proposition, and that's what's going to make projects like this happen. So I believe that makes sense for a lot of people. I think that most of you in the room are concerned about the economics of the fuel supply, the fuel mix, and the energy source, whereas we see it more as a security and resiliency proposition. The more diverse and the greater quantity of supply available, that diminishes your risks. And so we like that. We like diversifying the fuel supply. We like diversifying the power supply. We like diversifying the sources of energy, and we like to distribute them. Locating them all in one place makes that a single point of failure potentially. Distributing that reduces some of that potential. So I think diversification is going to continue. I think you're going to see more of it. And I think that regulatorily and technology-wise, it seems like we're well poised to allow that diversification to continue.
How about just as a follow-up, because you mentioned regulation, but now I think a new factor, especially over the last 6 to 9 months with the current political climate and new administration and new policies and so forth, even as recent as things happening this week while we're here.
Right.
From the perspectives of the folks in the room, they've got to contend with customer demands, regulation, and now new things happening from a policy perspective. Has the point of view that you just conveyed, has it shifted dramatically over the last 6 to 9 months, or has it remained steady?
I think that in terms of just flat out energy, it's remained fairly steady. Our story in the Army and in the military is security and resiliency. That's our first concern. So I think you're all aware, you may be aware, an executive order was signed yesterday, and we're part of the executive branch. So we follow what our leaders tell us to do. But I read that executive order this morning when it was published, and I saw energy is good and is still in vogue. Domestic energy is good and still in vogue. Renewables, by the way, are still good, still in vogue. It's an all-of-the-above energy strategy. So that part is what we're listening to, which is improving the opportunity for more secure and more resilient sources of power. That's what we're about. So I think we'll see how things play out with the future. But I think in terms of what the Army's after, we still see that opportunity wide and available to us, and we're still excited about projects.
Okay. Thank you for that. So listen, we're doing pretty well on time, and so before I maybe turn it back to you to cover anything that maybe you didn't get a chance to. Like the last segment, we heard some really great questions from the audience, and we have a few minutes. I didn't know if anybody wanted to ask Michael anything, if they would step up to the mic.
And I can only see shapes moving around out there.
Hi, Michael.
It's maybe you're leaving, but maybe you're asking a question.
H.G. Chisel. When I first got into this business, my first task was DoD and demand response. So I had an opportunity to work a lot with Defense Logistics Agency on demand response strategies and starting that path forward with renewable integration on military bases. Are you addressing, and you might have covered this, I had to be several places at once, but the solar integration and being able to be non-grid tied? I saw a lot of solar go in that was unusable in an outage in a particular area, and I always wondered what the conversation was in that commander's office when he's looking out and sees all that solar and the lights won't go on in his office.
Yeah, fair statement, right? So, rewind to what, a year ago? What was in the news about energy storage? There was probably a lot more of, I hope it's coming soon, or I think it may be coming soon, or I wish it could come soon, to today, and it's arriving. It's not yet at the price point that it needs to be at to make it, ubiquitous, but I think we're seeing it happen. It's arriving. So our plan was to facilitate generation and get that in a distributed fashion as an indirect benefit to the Army. Where we could facilitate that, what's good for the grid that serves the Army, was an indirect benefit, but that was goodness. With the idea that someday, if storage became economically viable, we would like to introduce storage onto those same projects. So we are concertedly going back to, in particular, solar, those solar projects that we have built, and we're going back to a revisit on what will it take to get storage added to those projects, and probably coupled with additional diesel generation set capability to have that islandable capability that I described. So that's our strategy there. The commanders are going to have to wait a few years for that to happen for some of these projects. Our newer projects, where we're bringing in solar, Los Alamitos is exactly that. Los Alamitos in Los Angeles that I mentioned, it's solar combined with battery storage, combined with the control systems, and combined with diesel gensets as well. And the idea is we'd like to put on the street the availability to create such a project that can feed the grid and pay for itself, right, by the developer, the project owner, using the project to pay for itself and make some money off of it. That's why they're doing it. In return for, in the event of an outage or a grid disruption, that project can turn inward and drive the base. Los Alamitos is particularly intriguing to us because it represents a situation that aligns several additional interests. Los Alamitos becomes, in the event of an emergency, becomes a support center for what's known as defense support for civil authorities. And I believe the most likely issue that they're contemplating is a large-scale earthquake. If that happens, Los Alamitos becomes a place where a sizable number of response forces will converge and stage and then be available to respond at the state level, the local level, and it's contemplated at that time that could be an extended outage. So we've asked for, or we expect that we'll be asking for somewhere in the order of 7 to maybe 30 days of capability at Los Alamitos to anticipate an outage of the grid for that duration and then provide a solution that can weather that, to then be there to support those authorities that are there to respond to the emergency. So it's there now with that project. We believe the economics are there for solar coupled with battery storage, coupled probably with some additional diesel gensets, and then the control systems. We think that's viable. Some of our earlier projects, it wasn't built in because it wasn't viable at the time. But the hope is we can fold that in a later phase for those projects. Long answer to your question, but it's a legitimate issue. That's our approach. We're in for the long haul.
So thank you for the question. And I think just, Michael, to net it out, you're going to be here this afternoon. I think you've made it abundantly clear. The Army is excited and energized to work with many of you, both via co-location or generating new assets. More is better. New entrants are preferred. And we really appreciate both your service and the insights today. And let's everybody give a big round of applause for Michael McGhee.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks. Good job.